This is Colleen from the Sherburne Public Library, and I've got with me tonight Brian McDowell, who is a publisher locally, and Mike Tefft, who is an author, a local author. So we've got a little discussion to do tonight. The topic tonight is what constitutes a good idea for publishing. So I'm going to let them mostly talk, and I'll just be here to moderate. So go for it, guys.
Mike, you want me to start?
Sure, I'll let you start.
Okay. I operate Log Cabin Books out of Hamilton. Have about 25 titles, and when I'm looking for a new title, the primary thing that I want to feel is that the author has some either expertise in the subject area they're writing about or considerable passion in that subject, or both. There are marketing considerations that we'll talk about in another conversation, but for me, I feel one of my roles as a local publisher is to encourage people who want to write, and there are many forms of publication that we'll talk about. So what constitutes a good idea is an idea that you either have in your experience or in your background, or something you feel passionate about writing about. And Mike is, I think, a really good example of an author who took an idea for which he has a passion and turned it into currently 2 books in an ongoing series. So, Mike, what first led you to want to write?
Well, I think I've always wanted to write, and for a long time I had no idea what I would write, to be honest. And I was probably thinking more literary, more not any specific genre. And what 2 things kind of got me writing. I heard about National Novel Writing Month, also called NaNoWriMo. And what that is every November, it's a challenge to write 50,000 words towards a novel in the month of November. And the first year I really heard about it, it was like the middle of November. So it's like, okay, well, not this year. So I've been kicking that around in the back of my head for a while, and what finally got me the idea was, of all things, Star Trek. Now, anybody who knows me knows I am a gigantic Star Trek fan, nerd, whatever you want to say. And it was right about it was one of the Star Trek movies, the new ones with Chris Pine and everybody. And my favorite character is Scotty, the engineer. And for those who don't know, my actual background is in electrical and computer engineering. So Scotty's always been like my character in Star Trek. And what the idea came, well, what would happen if Scotty was the captain and not Kirk? And I eventually sort of muddled that around in my head during the summer, and I ended up making turning it into steampunk, where I could use an airship instead of a starship. And for those of you who don't know what steampunk is, I call it Victorian science fiction. It's that Jules Verne, H.G. Wells kind of era of science fiction. So things like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, The Time Machine, even War of the Worlds. It's that sort of era where in my novels, I've kind of expanded the role of technology a bit. It's still that kind of technology, steam and mechanical, but it's progressed farther than it did in our actual time.
And for those of you watching, the background that Michael has chosen for this conversation is more or less a summary of the steampunk living room he would have. Colleen allowed him to have that. So
that is correct. Yes.
That's where his heart is.
That's very true. Very true.
So that the initial idea came from really Star Trek, like all good things do. But I think what constitutes a good idea is something like kind of what Brian said, that you are really, really passionate about. Because if you're going to write a book, it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Short stories are sprints. If you want to do short stories, great. You can toss those out, as frequently as you can write them. But a novel is a marathon. My first one took 2 years to write. The second one took about 3. And then it was a whole another year of getting it to the point to publish it. But it was probably 3 years of work on the actual novel. So it's not for you really have to care about what it is you're writing. Otherwise it won't take you through the dark tea times of the soul that you'll have to go through when you're writing.
That just turned really dark there for a minute. I will say this, it's interesting that you should mention that, but the first novel that Log Cabin Books published was a book called Going Up the Country, and it was actually a novelized version of the life of a woman who got married in the early 70s and moved to Maine with her husband and wrote about it 30 years later in more or less novelized form, although about 90% of the book really happened with the names changed. And she approached it differently. She actually wrote each chapter from a different character's point of view and published most of them, if not all of them, in literary magazines or literary websites as short stories. And then when the time came when she wanted to stitch the book together, she did that. So while you're right, it does take a lot of stick-to-itiveness and a lot of initiative. You can actually simplify the process and maybe keep your heart in it by writing it in segments instead of feeling like you have to tackle the entire manuscript at once. And Mike, I'm sure you're the first to acknowledge that when you finish the first manuscript and you think you're done, you're nowhere near done because you're going to change so much and take out and put in. So one way to make it easier on you is to do it in segments or do it as parts and entries, which you might call chapters, or you might call, sections of a chapter, and just write what comes to your mind. Certainly the longer process is to draw an outline and go after the whole book at once, but you don't have to do it that way, especially if you're someone who might be discouraged halfway through and give it up. I feel like I spent a lot of my time as a publisher encouraging people to write what they feel, write what is interesting to them, and not to worry about where it's going to end up or in what format it's going to end up. But not everyone has the engineer's discipline that Mike has. So I knew when he started, he was not going to be discouraged and give it up, which was to his credit.
That's very true. It is a long slog. I mean, you really got to hang in there. And I know a lot of times Mike had, moments of like, why am I doing this? I'm not sure I should be doing this.
I still have moments. I'm working on my third book now, and it's going about as fast as the second book. So,
yeah, but listen to what you just said. You're working on your third book.
Yes,
That's a thing. And books write themselves as quickly as they're supposed to. I've had authors who put their books away for years because of life intervening or other things happening, birth of children, things like that. And eventually they got back to them because the idea was still theirs. I have a question for you, Colleen. A lot of times, a local bookstore, maybe an independent bookstore, which is, I think, if the three of us were going to go to a bookstore, it would be an independent if at all possible.
Yeah.
They have a sense of what they want. And a lot of times I think it's similar to what a librarian or a director of a library wants. So what do you look for in a book, say a novel, that you decide to recommend to your membership? I mean, bestseller lists aside, what kinds of books are you?
That's a good question. And there isn't one answer, as you can imagine. So as a library, of course, we're part of a community, and the important thing, and I'm not the person who picks most of the books for our library. Kathleen Erath does a lot of that. She picks most of the adult books that we buy. And she's become very good at it, but she's been doing it for 20 years or something. So, but it's really important, I think, for us to know if it was a bookstore, it'd be know your customer. For a library, it's know your patrons. So part of our decision is this something that will appeal to our patrons? And that doesn't mean that we only buy things that appeal to our patrons, because there is a big group of patrons. A large amount of them are in one category. We have a lot in our area. We have a lot of people who read mysteries, and so they love mysteries, and we buy mysteries more than we probably buy anything. We also have a pretty good nonfiction following, so we buy a good amount of nonfiction, but a lot of thought process goes into it. We think about, our customer, but we also think, what might we push the boundary with a little bit? What else could we maybe, say, hey, you like this, you might like to try this. So we do try to push the boundaries a lot on the kinds of books we buy. Our budget is, what it is. It's a pretty good budget for the tiny library that we are in a small community. And we certainly can't complain about that. But yeah, we have a specific amount of money we can spend every year. So we try to get the majority of it, of course, is going to go toward those people that, are in all the time, that always take the same kind of books, or always looking for the same authors, things like that. And then there's the group of, we try to push and say, let's try this group. And I was saying earlier to you guys, the indie authors, like Mike, who do the self-publishing, they're becoming more and more known and available to us as librarians. Even Mike's book and his stuff is in the Ingram catalog, which that's huge for libraries. So we can actually see what's out there and know that there's other, besides the big publishers and the big authors that, the James Pattersons of the world that we all know about. So, so we will take chances here and there on, this might be neat. And I like to try to do that anyway, because, being married to an independent author is kind of like, I want to support these people because it's important, obviously. It's almost like it's supporting an art form. And, I'm kind of a big art supporter.
Like I mentioned my publishing house name and talked a little bit about the titles. You should mention your series and the title of the first book and the second book. And
oh, yes, I should. Yes. So my series is called the Reluctant series. And the first book is called The Reluctant Captain. And the second book, which just came out last June, is called The Reluctant Agent. So you might see where I came up with the series name from.
Yeah.
And the third book is going to be The Reluctant, and I have the plot set, but I still haven't quite worked out the title. I've got a couple ideas.
An author, maybe? I don't know.
No, that's my website.
That's right.
Yes, my website is www.reluctantauthor.com.
I want you to mention that. And I also want you to talk about the time period of the first novel, the actual calendar period.
Yeah, the first novel takes place in 1910, in the summer of 1910.
What drew you to that period?
Well, without giving too much away, there was because I want people to read the book. There was a major event that happened in 1909, and the Reluctant Captain is going to end up investigating that event. I'm not going to give too much else away because it gives away the story. But
that's perfect.
That's why I picked that time. The second book takes place 2 years later, and there was no special significance other than I wanted time for him to have become captain. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch given what I've said before. The chief engineer of the airship ends up becoming captain. And so the Reluctant Agent, he's now been captain for 2 years. So he's past his, his greenness as captain.
One that brings up an interesting point from a publisher. Certainly, I would have noticed early on that your specific interest was in the technology. But if you would come to me with the idea and said, and if I had said, are you going to research the early 1900s significantly before you write this so that it actually jives with what history showed us was happening at the time, and you had said no, I would have lost interest. But you actually did, I could tell, a fair amount of research on the period before you wrote your first words. You knew a lot about what you were talking about, not only about the incident, but the life and culture at the time, which I think is to your credit. Talk about how you achieved that knowledge.
Well, the internet is a wonderful thing, and I have to say I could never have written any of my books without the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I use it constantly. My research is probably, well, when it comes to writing, there's basically two schools of thought for writing. You either have the plotters, who are people that have meticulous outlines and everything is plotted down to the last, millimeter,
Mm-hmm.
or you have pantsers, which are people who write by the seat of their pants. I tend to be more of a pantser. I do have an overall outline, but when it comes to what I'm doing at a specific time, it really is more seat of the pants. So what ends up happening, and it's probably one of the reasons it takes me so long to do stuff, is as I'm writing a scene, it's like, okay, I've got to go from, well, I'll just say an example, this part of London to this part of London.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what are the streets? What does it look like? How long does it take? So I spend a lot of time on Google and Google Maps going through, okay, here's this point, okay. All right, and cars only could go this fast back then. Okay, it's going to take that long.
Well, I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit, because I think in your, and I don't want to give away too much of the book either, but in your case, your knowledge of the period really informed your plot, because there were definitely times when I sensed that as you came upon information about the culture and the history of the time, you used it actively in your plot. You didn't, I guess the way I summarize it is, you didn't put any coffee cups in any Game of Thrones scenes. You didn't.
I tried very hard not to.
You didn't have a digital wristwatch in there. You adhered so closely to the times, and certainly larger authors have whole research teams that can keep them honest. But an author who is so interested in what they're writing that they'll be meticulous about the period they're writing about is really special, I think.
Thank you.
That's to your credit. Period pieces are really popular, I think, Colleen, in libraries now. They certainly are in bookstores. So I imagine that something like the Reluctant series would do really well with your audience.
I think it will, once people realize what it is. So I think we'll end this segment. And I will say that both of those books are available at the Sherburne Public Library. And also they were just added to the ebook collection that you can download through 4 County. So please, check it out. It'll be a fun read, I think, because I think of it more as an adventure story, not, from just an outsider's point of view. I think that's the way people will look at it.
Absolutely. And I just want to say in closing that if you have an idea that you want to write about, don't overthink it. Don't ask permission. Write it, because no one else can write it the way you will write it. And that's what your voice is about. We can talk more about the process in the next segment, I guess.
Yes, we will.
And I would just say, a lot of authors take this tact, and I think it works. Write the book that you want to read.
Yep.
Yeah. Good advice. Well, great. Thank you guys both for doing this tonight. We'll do our next segment soon. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Better background to rival Mike's.
I know. We'll have to work on